You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
In the summer of 2001, Arthur Labe sat inside a traditional German beer garden with his family. The middle-aged man lived on Vancouver Island in Canada, where he worked as a house painter. But now he was on his dream vacation in Germany, visiting relatives that he hadn't seen for years. He'd been looking forward to this trip for ages, and he was having a total blast. Arthur felt grateful to be on this vacation at all. A few months earlier, he had coughed up some blood, and his wife Carol insisted that he go see their doctor on Vancouver Island. The doctor would tell Arthur that he was worried about lung cancer since Arthur had been a smoker when he was young. Thankfully, Arthur's chest x-rays and follow-up testing indicated he didn't have cancer, and his doctor said that it was fine for Arthur to go to Germany and enjoy his trip. And his cough actually cleared up completely a few days before he left for the trip. Arthur took a big swig of his beer and then thought about how great it felt to sit down and relax after a full day of walking all over the city. The walking was actually the only part of the trip that Arthur was not enjoying. They'd been on their feet so much that his lower back was starting to hurt. And so Arthur made a mental note to stop by a pharmacy on the way back to the hotel for some pain relievers or maybe a hot pad. Arthur took another big sip of his beer and then looked around at all the other tourists crowded into the beer garden. Then he nodded his head at the polka band in appreciation and then settled in, enjoying a sunny afternoon and the warm glow of a nice German beer. 2 hours later, the sun had sunk behind the trees, and Arthur stood up from the table to head back to the hotel. As he got to his feet, a shock of pain burst through his lower back. Arthur immediately sank back into his seat, very surprised. Then he tried to stand again, but every time he moved, a burning pain shot through his back and up his spine. Carol was surprised that her husband couldn't stand and asked what was wrong. Arthur told her he just needed to breathe for a second, but after a few minutes, the pain was still shooting up his back. And every time he tried to stand up, the pressure on his back was blinding. Finally, he just shook his head and told Carol he did need to go to the hospital. Something was going on with his back. She nodded, then asked their son-in-law, Brian, to run and grab their rental car. 15 minutes later, Arthur sat in the front passenger seat as Brian drove towards the hospital with Carol and Arthur's daughter, Jenny, in the back seat. Every time the car hit a bump, Arthur gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur could feel a brutal headache coming on too, and he wondered if the way he was feeling now had anything to do with that nasty cough he had back home. Finally, the car turned a corner, and Arthur saw the hospital up ahead, and not a moment too soon, because right at that moment, Arthur's vision had begun to blur, so he was leaning his head against the headrest and closing his eyes. He felt hot and achy, and his forehead was dripping with sweat, and by the time the car actually stopped, Arthur felt delirious. In fact, Arthur barely noticed as his car door opened and 2 hospital staff reached in to help him stand up. An hour later, Arthur opened his eyes and realized he was lying on his side in a hospital bed with an IV drip in his arm. Slowly, the beige room came into focus. He could hear the whirring and beeping of machines in the room, as well as conversations drifting in from the hallway. The room suddenly felt chilly, and Arthur hoped that his fever might be breaking. His headache was getting less intense too, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt like he could actually think clearly. Arthur looked down towards the foot of his bed, and he saw Carol speaking to a middle-aged doctor in a very quiet voice. When Carol noticed Arthur was awake, she smiled at him, but Arthur knew his wife well, and he knew the look she was giving him was her putting on a very brave face. Something clearly was wrong. At this point, the doctor turned to Arthur and introduced himself as Dr. Gent. He told Arthur that while he was unconscious, they'd performed a spinal tap so they could examine his spinal fluid for potential infections, and the lab work had just come back. Dr. Gent kept a neutral expression as he told Arthur that his spinal fluid had a high white blood cell count, which indicated that his body was fighting an infection. Dr. Gent suspected that Arthur had a very serious condition called bacterial meningitis, which meant that the membranes that protected his brain and spinal column were swelling. He explained that meningitis is a potentially life-threatening infection, but they had already started Arthur on antibiotics, so he should make a full recovery. Arthur felt overwhelmed by everything the doctor was saying, and he just wanted to know how long it was going to be before he felt better again. But before he could ask any questions, Dr. Gent told him to try and rest. He was going to be in the hospital for a few days at least. A week later, Arthur's daughter, Jenny, was getting ready to go to work on Vancouver Island. Jenny had decided to fly back to Canada while her father was still in the hospital, but she couldn't stop worrying about him. So far, doctors in Germany had tried 6 different antibiotics, but her dad didn't respond to any of them. He just kept getting sicker. Jenny was about to head out the door when her phone rang. She lunged for it, knowing it was the time her mother usually called from Germany. For a split second, Jenny hoped that her mom was calling to say her dad was all better, and they were just going to resume their vacation and everything was great. But as soon as Jenny picked up the phone, she could hear that her mom was crying. Carol told Jenny that the swelling in her father's brain was getting worse, and now Dr. Gent was saying that it looked like her father was going to die. Jenny had not prepared herself for the possibility of losing her dad, and she scrambled to think of some way she could help. Finally, she offered to drive over to her dad's doctor's office here on Vancouver Island to basically fill in Arthur's primary care doctor about what was going on, to see if maybe he had some ideas that the doctors in Germany had not tried yet. An hour later, Jenny fidgeted as she watched her father's doctor in Vancouver Island review her dad's scans on a computer monitor and flip through his lab results. He asked Jenny a few questions about her dad's condition, and she did her best to fill in the blanks. Finally, the doctor closed the files and turned to her, and she sat up expectantly. But he just shook his head and told Jenny that, despite her father's serious illness, his charts looked remarkably normal. The doctor told her that her dad was in good health when he left for Germany. He might have picked up a bug while on the trip, but his infection should be responding to antibiotics by now. Jenny begged the doctor to please just look one more time, and then Jenny held her breath as the doctor did pick up the lab results and looked them over one more time. Then Jenny noticed the doctor's expression change, like something had just occurred to him. Then he leaned in and he told Jenny there was one possible but highly unlikely explanation. Jenny asked him to please tell her. At this point, her family was willing to consider anything. So the doctor explained that several weeks ago, her father's blood work had shown no signs of lung cancer, and they had rejoiced. But lost in the excitement was some less positive news. Arthur's blood had tested positive for a fungal infection called Cryptococcus. A lot of people get Cryptococcus, which had existed on Vancouver Island for years. But it's usually harmless, and most people's immune systems fight it off easily. It's only dangerous for people with compromised immune systems. And Arthur's immune system at the time was fine, so the doctor didn't even tell Arthur that he had this fungal infection. Jenny asked if this fungus could cause meningitis, and the doctor nodded, but only in extremely rare cases. However, if her father's meningitis was caused by a fungal infection, he would need completely different medications than what he was receiving in Germany right now. Antibiotics cannot stop a fungal infection. If Jenny's father had fungal meningitis, that would mean that for the past few days, the treatments Arthur was receiving in Germany were doing nothing. Jenny tried to stay calm as the doctor placed a call to the hospital in Germany. If they started Arthur on antifungal medication right now, he might survive. Jenny just hoped they weren't too late. Several months later, in the early winter of 2002, an animal pathologist named Sally Lester was in her laboratory on mainland British Columbia, a few miles away from Arthur's home. She slid a glass slide under her microscope, then bent down over the eyepiece to take a look. The slide she had put under there contained tissue from the carcass of a dead porpoise that had washed up on the beach on nearby Vancouver Island. Dr. Lester focused her lens on a tiny cell that looked like a boiled egg. This kind of cell had become a familiar sight to her over the past year. These odd egg-shaped cells had been sent to Dr. Lester from veterinary clinics all around Vancouver Island. A growing number of sick dogs and cats were showing up at vet clinics with shortness of breath and discharge running from their noses. In more serious cases, the animals were having seizures. Some had mysterious lumps on their heads, and all of the animals had pockets of pus called abscesses below their eyes. Veterinarians had sent in samples of the abscess tissue to Dr. Lester so she could examine them in her lab, and every time she'd found these little yellow cells that looked like boiled eggs. She knew what the cells meant, that the animals were infected with Cryptococcus, a fungus that grew on Vancouver Island. It was common for animals and humans alike to contract Cryptococcus by inhaling the spores floating in the air. Humans and animals rarely got sick from these spores. In fact, Dr. Lester usually saw no more than maybe 6 to 10 animals with Cryptococcus infections in a year. But recently, vets on Vancouver Island had been sending her about 10 cases every single month. Dr. Lester was stumped about what could be causing the number of these infections to rise so quickly. Then, porpoises began washing up on shore, which had given Dr. Lester a very eerie feeling. Dead porpoises should rarely wash ashore, but now it was happening every few weeks. And when she began reading the porpoise autopsy reports, she started feeling even more unnerved. The porpoise's lungs had been riddled with inflammation from pneumonia. Their organs were swollen and covered in flower-like tumors. And now, as Dr. Lester looked at the slide, she realized that all this damage was being caused by a Cryptococcus infection. The porpoise's blood was loaded with the fungus. Dr. Lester sat back on her stool, feeling a knot starting to form in her gut. She knew how porpoises would have contracted the Cryptococcus spores. Since spores are airborne, the fungus would have floated out over the ocean and settled on top of the water. The porpoises would have inhaled the spores when they came up and broke the surface to breathe. What she didn't understand was why the number of cases was increasing now. Something weird was definitely going on. And then Dr. Lester had a chilling thought. If more animals are getting fungal infections, maybe more people are too. After all, we all breathe the same air. Dr. Lester picked up the phone to call the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. She knew it was now time to get the human infectious disease authorities involved. Half an hour later, Dr. Murray Fife hung up the phone on his desk at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. He was the organization's head epidemiologist, and he had been absolutely swamped lately. And now, after speaking with Dr. Lester, he needed a moment to consider what she had told him about this potential outbreak of fungal infections on Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wanted to get feedback on Dr. Lester's concerns from a colleague who lived on Vancouver Island. So he picked up the phone again, this time to call the Vancouver Island Health Authority. The microbiologist who picked up said very matter-of-factly that Dr. Lester was right. There was a definite increase in human Cryptococcus infections on Vancouver Island, but not among the patients they would normally expect. Usually, it was just people with compromised immune systems that got sick from Cryptococcus, but lately, healthy adults were getting sick from the fungus. It was bizarre and basically unheard of. It made no sense to Dr. Fife. Cryptococcus fungus had been on Vancouver Island for years, so why was it suddenly so dangerous now? He worried that something about the fungus itself was changing, and he wondered if it could even be stopped. A few days later, Dr. Fife sat in a conference room totally surrounded by piles of hospital records and feeling completely exhausted. For the last week, he and a scientist at the University of British Columbia named Karen Bartlett had been combing the region's hospital records in hopes of finding other Cryptococcus infections. His eyes hurt from hours spent reading, but they still had not figured out when the number of infections had begun to rise. Dr. Bartlett cleared her throat and looked up while holding a file above her head. Dr. Fife raised his eyebrows as she explained that this file, was the oldest human case she'd found. It was from over 2 years ago, the beginning of 1999. The patient had been in good health when Cryptococcus made her sick, just like a lot of the recent cases. A few minutes later, Dr. Bartlett gasped and handed Dr. Fife another file. It was the medical records of a lively 45-year-old mother who had started to feel lousy just a few months ago in the fall of 2001. By the time the doctors tested her for Cryptococcus, the fungus had infected her brain and she died shortly after. Dr. Fife was shocked. He'd never heard of Cryptococcus killing an otherwise healthy adult. Even Arthur Labe, who'd been on death's door in Germany last summer, he'd recovered from his infection after receiving antifungal treatment. Suddenly, the stakes in their investigation seemed much higher. Not only were healthy adults contracting Cryptococcus, but the fungus was now, apparently, deadly, and Dr. Fife had no idea why. A week later, Dr. Fife was back at his desk, feeling both amazed and horrified at the unfolding health crisis. After he and Dr. Bartlett discovered that Cryptococcus infections were killing people on Vancouver Island, They'd sent samples of the fungus to a lab for further analysis. And now Dr. Fife was staring at the test results, and they weren't at all what he expected. The fungus that was infecting the animals and the people on Vancouver Island was an entirely new kind of Cryptococcus fungus than what had been on Vancouver Island for years. Under the microscope, analysts could tell that the new Cryptococcus was a completely different species from what residents were used to. But the new strain should never have been in Vancouver Island. The newcomer strain of Cryptococcus is typically found in the bark of eucalyptus trees in Australia and other warm places. It had never been seen so far north, and especially not in a cold and damp climate like Vancouver Island. Dr. Fife wondered how a tropical fungus got so far north. There were hardly any eucalyptus trees on Vancouver Island, which meant that Dr. Fife had no idea where the fungus was hiding, or how it could even survive in this environment. Dr. Fife called Dr. Bartlett to explain the alarming lab results and admit he had no idea how to find this toxic new fungus. She paused, then told him she had an idea. She said it was time to get some boots on the ground. A week later, Dr. Bartlett stood on a residential street on Vancouver Island, surrounded by several students from a local college. These were her volunteers, and together they were going to comb the backyards and backwoods of all of Vancouver Island, searching for answers. Dr. Bartlett looked from student to student and reminded them of their objective. They would dig up soil samples and swab tree barks in the hopes that they would capture the new strain of Cryptococcus in the wild. Each student nodded and said they understood. So Dr. Bartlett divided them into teams. She sent 2 teams to collect samples around the neighborhood. Then she led her group to the first house on the street where the owner was expecting them. Dr. Bartlett was pleased to see that the homeowner, who was a middle-aged woman with tanned and sun-worn skin, was waiting in the garage. Dr. Bartlett waved as she and her volunteers walked up the driveway, and the woman led them around into her backyard. Dr. Bartlett had selected this house for a very specific reason. The homeowner, the woman, had survived a recent Cryptococcus infection. Dr. Bartlett hoped that the fungus might be found somewhere in this woman's immediate environment, but failing that, Dr. Bartlett thought that by interviewing this woman and other survivors, once she knew what they all had in common, she could use that information to track down the source of the fungus. Dr. Bartlett nodded to the students, and they fanned out into the backyard. She watched as they stooped over flower beds and scraped bark off trees, and while the students went to work, Dr. Bartlett interviewed the woman who lived there. Dr. Bartlett asked the woman where she went on a daily basis, and the woman listed off popular nature trails she liked to hike, beaches she frequented, and also the friends and family that she visited most often. Eventually, Dr. Bartlett had asked all her questions, so she thanked the woman for helping and then tucked her notes into her satchel. Then, once all her students were done taking their samples, Dr. Bartlett led them down the street to the next house on their list. A few days later, Dr. Bartlett sat in a conference room at the British Columbia CDC, going over her notes while she waited for Dr. Fife. Dr. Bartlett was feeling frustrated. After canvassing what seemed like the entirety of Vancouver Island, none of the samples that she or her volunteers had collected had come back positive for spores of this new type of Cryptococcus. And her interviews with all these survivors had led nowhere too. The only thing the infected people on her list had in common was that they all lived on Vancouver Island, which of course made it impossible to pinpoint where the spores were actually coming from. They could be anywhere on the island. A few moments later, Dr. Fife walked into the office with a grim look on his face. He told Dr. Bartlett that somebody else had just shown up at a Vancouver Island hospital with a Cryptococcus infection, which brought the total of people infected to 30 so far. Dr. Bartlett had this nagging sense that the situation, which was already bad, could actually still get much worse. The summer of 2002 was approaching, and she was worried that there could be an explosion of cases as the weather got warmer. She stood and began pacing the room, racking her brain for ideas. Dr. Fife leaned against the doorframe, scratching his chin. But then Dr. Bartlett stopped pacing. She turned to Dr. Fife and asked if he'd be up for a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights. He laughed a little because he always did late nights and they always worked all the time, But Dr. Bartlett could tell, he was up for more. So Dr. Bartlett explained what she had in mind. Since her interviews with infected people had failed to get the information they needed, she suggested they start talking to the owners of infected pets. There were so many animal cases that there might be an overlap in the animals' daily schedules. It was a long shot, but there was a chance that it would help them pinpoint where the fungus spores were coming from. Dr. Fife nodded and asked Dr. Bartlett if she'd like some coffee. If they were going to spend the next few weeks driving all over Vancouver Island interviewing hundreds and hundreds of pet owners, they would need a lot more caffeine. A week later, Dr. Bartlett climbed out of her car and knocked on the door of a house on Vancouver Island. A broad-shouldered woman with big brown eyes answered the door, and Dr. Bartlett followed her into the kitchen. This was the 24th pet owner that Dr. Bartlett had interviewed in person, so at this point, she basically had her questions memorized. She began by asking where the pet owner regularly took her dog. And the woman gave predictable answers, like hiking trails and restaurants and friends' houses. Except this time, the broad-shouldered woman also mentioned a place called Rathtrevor Beach Provincial Park. That name stuck with Dr. Bartlett through the rest of the interview because other pet owners had mentioned it as well, and so Dr. Bartlett felt like that place might be worth looking into. About 36 hours later, Dr. Bartlett met her student volunteers at Rathtrevor Beach and told them to swab everything. And 2 weeks after submitting those samples, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. Fife had a startling realization. Fir trees all over Rathtrevor Beach tested positive for the new deadly fungus, and so the air in this park contained huge quantities of spores. And once Dr. Fife and Dr. Bartlett looked into this park further, the explanation for why this was became clear. Because of its location, the weather at Rathtrevor Beach was unlike the rest of Vancouver Island. It was warmer and enjoyed a drier, more Mediterranean climate. In other words, it was the perfect place for a fungus that prefers the warm, dry air of Australia rather than the typically chilly and wet Canada. So anybody who stopped at that park or just lived near it would have been breathing in these spores day in and day out. And most of the people who had contracted this infection were eventually found to have gone into or near this park. In the summer of 2002, Dr. Fife posted signs at Rathtrevor Beach Park warning people about the danger posed by this fungus. However, the park was not closed because Dr. Bartlett and her students eventually found spores in several other spots on Vancouver Island as well. So they realized there was really no way to actually contain the outbreak because clearly it basically had spread all around the island. Between 1999 and 2006, 165 human cases of Cryptococcus infections were reported in British Columbia. In total, 8 people died. As for Arthur Labe, he recovered from the disease once his hospital in Germany put him on that antifungal medication, and he was ultimately able to return to work, but his wife Carol says he's not quite as active as he used to be. Nobody knows how this fungus arrived on Vancouver Island, but the spores can live on surfaces for many, many years. So it could have been transported by humans, or wind currents coming up from the tropics, or even by porpoises that migrated across the ocean. Today, scientists are still working to find a way to prevent this infection, but currently, most scientists think there's really nothing we can do until humans and animals just naturally develop immunity to the disease.
In 2018, a 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup caught him by surprise because he had actually just recently moved to Colorado in order to be closer to his girlfriend, so naturally he was devastated. After a few weeks of being so depressed and kind of just moping around and going through the motions in his life at this point, one of his very close friends suggested to him, like, hey man, look, why don't you just make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one. Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. So online dating was definitely not on his radar. But he was so lonely and sad, he figured, you know what? I got nothing to lose. And so he made himself a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and they got on great. And so they wanted to get together and actually meet each other in person. But Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek's. There wasn't a natural meeting place. And they're going back and forth about where they want to go. And finally, Leah just says, hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope, and you can lay on it and look up through the trees and you can see the stars. And so that would be a cool thing to do on our first date, go stargazing together. So the date night finally came, and Derek was really excited. He was nervous too, because even though they talked on the phone, this is the first time they're going to see each other. And so the plan was he was going to drive out to her town and actually pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there they would make their way over to this park. And so Derek pulls up to the hair salon right as Leah is coming outside, and she's all excited and she's waving to him. She runs over and she gets in the car and they hug and kiss on the cheek. And it's like they knew each other, but they didn't know each other because their entire relationship was online or, via texting or a phone call. And so it's like they had history, but they didn't. But either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to this access road that was going to bring them into this park. And when Leah told him to make this turn, it didn't look like a very well marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like this kind of random access road that Derek would not have associated with a big public park, but he doesn't know the area, and so he turns and he starts heading down this road. And the road went from cement to dirt pretty quickly, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, did I take a wrong turn? Does she know like where she's going? This does not feel like the way you drive into a big park, the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so right away, Derek's stress is gone because now it's confirmed in his mind that, okay, that's a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leah, where should I park? Because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a parking lot. There also didn't appear to be anybody else on this field or on this road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it did not look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts going up this road, and he sees maybe 300 feet ahead of him are dim headlights of another car making their way down the road towards him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did is he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass, even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him. He figured just give them the right of the road. And so as they start moving forward, he can see that it's actually this big van, and they're moving pretty slowly, and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass, and he's not thinking anything of this. He's thinking that this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super aggressive. He really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek, and he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively, he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs his flashlight that he kept right in the center console, and he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big guy who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry, I'm the caretaker here of this whole property, and we've had an issue with poachers in the area, and I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car, go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car, and he kind of joked with Leah. And he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him, and that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to react to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little bit odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weird guy just blocked us in, and I'm confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what I said to the guy and what he said to me, but she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was typing on her phone. And so Derek thinks, whatever, and just throws the car back in drive and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into a space, and he and Leah get out and they put a blanket out right next to the car, but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out and they sit down, and very quickly they start swapping stories and they're laughing and they're stargazing and they're having some wine and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on. And he notices to his left, up at the top of the hill, so the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time, Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights, and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand and he looks at Derek and he's like, "Give me your keys and your wallet." And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, "Come on, give us your keys and wallet." And Derek's like, "Great, I'm getting set up by my date, who I've spent the past 2 hours with, I had a connection with this girl." And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah, and he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around, and she goes, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you." And this is when Derek looks at them both, and he goes, "No." And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek could handle himself, and very quickly he was able to get up, and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy and then back at Leah, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now." As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so as he's holding them both at gunpoint, and he's looking over at Leah like, "Really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now?" As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then called dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, "Yep, go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there, and you're gonna go up this field, you're gonna see me, I got these two people at gunpoint." As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other, and they just turn around and bolt. They figure, he's distracted, we can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so instinctively, he takes off running after them, and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his, someone's shooting at him, and he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this." He turns around, runs back to his vehicle, he starts it up, and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again, like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn, before he was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, "Hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago, and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name, here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now?" And they said, "Yep, we'll send some to you." And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him, and they got out, and he explained again what happened, and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date, but at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead, and he goes, "That's the van. It's still here." And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, "Just stay in here. We're going to go check this van out." And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearing behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point he sees them put their pistols away and they go in the van. They're kind of shining with their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walked back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful, and it looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The two officers immediately called in additional backup, and before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van of a crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlights set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy, they never found the girl, and Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon, like right down the road, I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there, and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. And this whole thing, your whole relationship with her has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing, and he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is, what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying? Would I have wound up in the back of that van? In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend while her daughter and her husband were out of town. Her daughter had 3 kids, 2 that were under the age of 6 and 1 who was 15 years old, and her name was Alyssa. And so anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for longer than just a single day, like if she was taking care of them overnight, she would just stay at their house so as not to disrupt their lives more than she needed to. And so their house was a modest single-story home in a nice suburb of Dallas, Texas, where the crime rate is basically 0 and everybody in the neighborhood knows each other. And so this particular night that she's over there looking after them was like any other. She put the 2 young ones to bed first, and then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen chatting, talking about school, before ultimately both of them went to bed. So because their house is a single-story home, all the bedrooms are on the only floor of the house. And so Barbara and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, looking out to the side of the property. And so as soon as Barbara got in her room, she opened up the window that was right next to her bed, because as a kid, she always slept with the window open. And even though her daughter's house had air conditioning, she preferred to keep the window open. So window's open, she has a screen that's in her window, and Barbara crawls into bed and she falls asleep. At about 3 a.m., Barbara wakes up to the sound of rustling coming from outside of her window. And so she hears it, but it sounds an awful lot like it's probably just a dog or a cat or some other animal that's in the area. It did not seem like a big deal to her, and she was just going to forget about it. But then she heard it again, and it sounded much more like footsteps, and they sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. And so she rolled over onto her elbows and she pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out the screen door. And so the moon was out, so there was pretty good illumination, and so she could clearly see the side of the house. She could see the side of the house, she could see the fence that separated their property and their neighbors, and then she could see the neighbor's house and all their lights are off. And she noticed propped up against the fence on their side of the fence, so on their property, was this bike that she didn't recognize. And she's looking at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? It's too big to be either of the 6-year-old's bikes. Whose bike is that? And as she's looking at the bike, she hears more rustling coming from the left, which is closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara presses her face up against the screen to try to look out the window towards the left, because whatever's making the sound is now out of her view. And as she's got her face pressed up against the screen trying to look, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes from right underneath Alyssa's room. He's got that high school Letterman jacket, like the classic, football jacket that high school kids wear. He comes out of the bushes wearing that, and he's got his hood pulled up, and he doesn't look over at her. He's just backing up away from Alyssa's room, and he's looking up into Alyssa's room. And so Barbara immediately thinks, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends, maybe a boyfriend, I don't know, and Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before I said I was going to be here to look after them, and that message didn't get passed to him, and so he's here. All these scenarios are going through Barbara's head, but all she knew is she's not going to call the cops on some teenage kid that's coming to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she's going to confront him, because Barbara was actually a high school teacher and had been for decades. And so she'd had lots of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers, and she was pretty good at standing her ground and being firm and kind of getting teenagers to listen to her. So she figured she would just go out there and be stern with him and he'd get the message. And so she quietly gets off of her bed. She walks out of her room to the front of the house. So he's over here, side of the house. She's going to the front of the house. She flips on the lights as soon as she's outside, and she quickly walks around around to the edge of the porch where she can poke her head over and see right down the side of the house where this kid's gonna be. So she pokes her head over and she goes, "Can I help you?" And this kid turns and looks at her for the first time, and immediately Barbara's like, "Oh, whoa, he is not a teenager. He looks like he's in his 20s, if not 30s. No matter what, he is a lot older than Alyssa." And it caught her so off guard, she didn't really know how to react to it. She was just looking at this guy who looks so much older, but he's got a bike and he's wearing a Letterman jacket. And so Barbara's a little bit confused. And so she's thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she's thinking, this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. And so as she's thinking about this, she's also registering that this guy, he seems completely unfazed. He's just looking up at her, and he actually starts taking steps towards her to the point where Barbara says, "Stop where you are." And he does. And he looks up at her and he says, "I'm looking for Alyssa. Is she home?" And so as Barbara is just glaring at this guy, hoping that will be enough to get him to leave, but he's not leaving, it occurs to her that this could be a misunderstanding. And so thinking on her feet, she says to him, "Who did you say you're looking for? Lisa?" Without any hesitation, he goes, "No, I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here." Barbara went silent for a second because he was right. That was her name, and she certainly was here. But she did not want him coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here, or at the very minimum, that she knew who he was. And so Barbara says to the guy, "I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back." And he appears to get the message. And so Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the door behind her. And then she went into Alyssa's room and she shook her foot to wake her up. And so Alyssa kind of sits up and she's looking around and she's like, "What's going on?" And Barbara looks at her and she's kind of annoyed with how the night's gone. And at this point, she's kind of blaming Alyssa for probably having invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. And she says to Alyssa, "Did you invite a boy here tonight?" And Alyssa's like, "No, what are you talking about?" Barbara narrowed her eyes and she said, "Well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by name, and he knows you live here, and he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 a.m. is not very polite, and he shouldn't do it again?" Alyssa's confused, and she's looking at her grandmother like, "What are you talking about?" And so she leans back and she opens the curtain of her window, and she looks outside, and immediately she pulls her head back in, and she says, "Grandma, he asked for me by name?" And Barbara's like, "Yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here." And Alyssa's like, "We have to call 911. I've never seen him before in my life." Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. This was a stranger. This is not a friend. This is probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. And so as she's having this realization, they both hear footsteps out on the front porch. And at this, Barbara goes into full protective grandmother mode, and she tells Alyssa, "Stay in your bed, do not move." And Barbara runs out of her room. She goes into her bedroom, and she shuts that window and locks it, and then runs to the front of the house to make sure that door was locked, because she thought she locked it when she came in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She gets right in front of it, and she can see that it's locked. And now she's standing right on the other side of the door, kind of waiting to see what's going to happen. And this guy is standing on the porch, but obscured. She can't see him because he's on the other side of the door. And it's silent for a second. And as she's standing there just waiting for something to happen, she hears knocking on the door. And it startled her when she heard it, and she yelled out, "There's no Alyssa McCarran here. You have the wrong house. You need to leave or I'm calling the police." And the knocking stops for a second, and he says, "I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside." He goes back to knocking, and Barbara picks up her phone and she calls 911, and she intentionally talks really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious she is calling the police. And very clearly this guy picked up on what Barbara was doing, because the knocking stopped and she saw him through the little slit of glass next to the door run to the left of the house, back towards the side where his bike was. And so Barbara, while on the phone, runs into the bedroom where she was sleeping, and she looks out the side window, and the last she sees of this guy is riding his bike across the street. And then he stops next to an SUV, and he opens a trunk, and he throws the bike in the trunk, and he gets in the passenger side of the car, and they drive off, which means whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa, or whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police show up a couple minutes later, and at this point, this creep and whoever he was with are long gone, But Barbara still gives her description of the vehicle and description of the night and what happened. And the police told her that over the past couple of weeks, they've gotten very similar reports from other households where there are young girls inside of the house. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man that would use social media to figure out where kids lived, and then he would dress up like a teenager, and then he would go stalk them. And so whatever Alyssa had listed online, he had been able to deduce that she lived there, and who knows how long he had been looking in the window at her at night. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida that wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They said they were willing to cover all of her expenses as long as she was willing to post a couple of times while she was at the hotel, showing off how great the hotel was. They also told her to bring along a female friend, and that friend, they would cover all of her expenses as well. Even though Wendy didn't know if she had any girl friends that would want to do this with her, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity because she was trying to make being an influencer be her full-time job. And so opportunities like this were huge for her. And so she said yes, even before she knew if she could bring along a friend like they asked her to. And so sure enough, over the next couple of days, as she reached out to her network to see if there's any females that wanted to come with her, everybody was either busy or wasn't that interested or they had plans. And so since she did not want to cancel, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend. And so she reached out to her good friend Mitch, who's this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close friends. And she said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female, but you're gonna have to do. And so Mitch agreed to do it, and Wendy thought to herself, well, worst case scenario is they're not willing to pay for Mitch's, expenses, and that she would pay for them, and she told Mitch as much. And so they thought that was just fine. They figured that was a good solution. And so the day arrives, and Wendy and Mitch are really excited about this trip. They don't often get to go travel around as influencers. And so they hop on a plane, they fly first class to Miami. When they get there, they go down, they get their bags at a baggage claim, and then they go out to the curb, and right away, Wendy sees there's this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he's holding up a sign that has her last name on it and the logo of the hotel on it. And so she waves to him and walks over, and Mitch is following right behind. And this guy looks at her and he says, okay, well, where's your friend? And that's when she says, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch because none of my girlfriends wanted to go. So I brought Mitch along. And so this guy lowers his sunglasses and he looks at Mitch and he kind of looks up and down. Then he puts his sunglasses back and he turns and he walks towards this beautiful black SUV that's parked right up against the curb. And so Wendy and Mitch follow him, and this guy opens up the back door, and Wendy and Mitch get in. The guy takes their luggage and puts it in the back of the vehicle and shuts it. And as soon as Wendy and Mitch sit inside of this car, the driver is visibly upset. He's kind of ranting and raving, and the front passenger window was down. And so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle, like this guy that had just picked them up. He must be communicating with him somehow. He can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't know him. But sure enough, as they kind of are tuning into what he's saying, he has a very thick accent, and he's saying, where is the other girl? You're not supposed to have a guy. It's two girls, not one girl, one guy. It's two girls. Where is the other girl? As Wendy is hearing this, she feels so uncomfortable, not just for herself, but for Mitch too, because she asked him to come along and had said, oh, it won't be a big deal. They won't mind. But clearly they do mind. And so Wendy's trying to explain to the driver that, I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend. And so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything that he touches. I'll pay for his hotel, his flight, everything. But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration came from a place of being frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever they had planned to do because now Mitch is in the mix. And so as Wendy and the driver are kind of going back and forth and the driver's getting more and more frustrated, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped in the front seat, and he and the driver started arguing with each other in Portuguese. And so for about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are looking at each other like, what is going on here? And these guys are yelling at each other, and then they stop, and the driver turns around again, and one more time he says to Wendy, where is the other girl? And Wendy says, there is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it. At this point, the driver makes a sound like he was disgusted with both of them, and he raises his hand up like this, and he turns to face the road in front of him. And the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch, He gets out of the passenger seat, goes around to the back, opens the back of the truck, takes their luggage out, throws it onto the curb, goes to the door that is closest to Mitch, opens it up, and he tells them to get out. And so Wendy and Mitch climb back out onto the curb. The guy shuts the door behind them. He hops back in the front seat, and that car peels away. That was it. At this point, Wendy's thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the hotel and the people that I had been communicating with to set this whole thing up. I bet they are just the drivers, and they were told to pick up two girls, and we showed up with a girl and a guy, and it screwed them up, and they got mad, and they got really mad, I guess, and then they left. And so I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. And so she opens up her email and she sends a message to Marissa, who was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was buying her plane ticket. And then she sent another message to the Instagram account that had over 10,000 followers that she had been going back and forth with quite a bit, that had actually originally reached out to her. And so for a couple of minutes, Wendy is watching her phone, waiting for a response. And at some point, Mitch says to her, by the time we get a response to either your, Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? And so they agree, they hop in an Uber and they drive the short distance to this hotel. And as soon as they get out, Wendy notices something that at the time did not seem like a big deal, which was the logo of the hotel, the one in real life right in front of her. It was a little bit different than the one that is on the Instagram page, the one she'd been talking back and forth with. That was their profile picture. It's different than the one in real life. And so that stood out to her just because she had looked at that page a number of times. But it was definitely the same hotel, and so she didn't think much of it. And she and Mitch walked inside right up to the front desk, and Wendy asked to speak with a manager. And shortly thereafter, a manager comes out and she asks Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They go inside and she says, okay guys, what's going on? What do you need? And so Wendy explains the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. And she said, look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude and they wouldn't give us a ride here. And I just want to let you know what happened. We don't care. We got a ride here, but we just figured you should know. And the woman looks at her kind of puzzled and she says, who was the person you talked to? You said Marissa? And Wendy's like, yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here. And the manager looks at her and she says, no, I'm the marketing person and my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel, because we don't have any influencers that are here right now, and I would have known about this. Wendy can't believe it, and she pulls up the Instagram page she's been talking to, and she shows it to the manager. And the manager takes it, and she's pretty surprised by what she's looking at, and she's like, this is our old account. We deleted this, or I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo, everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh. So I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our account. It's just, we don't use it anymore. I don't know how anyone got a hold of it. At this point, it clicked for Wendy that this whole thing was a facade, that this whole time she was being conned, and what really scared her is, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with the other female friend, what would they have done with her? But at this moment, Wendy just feels totally overwhelmed by the entire moment. She's so embarrassed that she thought this was real, and she dragged Mitch along, and this whole thing was just fake. She's so embarrassed that she just approached this manager who basically said, that's all fake. And so she just wanted to leave. And so she stands up and she says, I'm really sorry for wasting your time, to the manager, and she and Mitch leave. She goes outside and she just sits down and she's crying. And Mitch says, hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened, because, clearly there were plans for you, and, had you brought a female friend, and they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists. And so Wendy does call the police and she explains what happened. And she's surprised when they say, hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened. And so Wendy tells them where they are, and she's a little bit surprised that they want to send a detective over to talk about this, because in her mind, this isn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened. But either way, they go sit on the bench right outside the hotel and they wait for the detective to show up. And just a couple of minutes later, he does. He walks up, he introduces himself, and he says, hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat. And so they go inside and they sit down, and Wendy and Mitch go over their story one more time. And after they're done, the detective says, look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in. So in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. And so they will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts. and then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. And so probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along, who posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were upset with you, and that's why they decided it wasn't worth it. So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, I'm sure you were spared a much worse fate.